Penguin Random House Audio presents Building the Great Society, Inside Lyndon Johnson's White House, by Joshua Zeitz. Read for you by Dan Warren. For Angela, Lillian, and Naomi. Preface. November 22nd, 1963. Why don't you pack a bag and fly with me to Fort Worth tonight? Lyndon Johnson suggested to his friend Jack Valenti. The date was November 21st, 1963, and Valenti, who ran a successful advertising and public relations firm in Houston, could scarcely foretell the lasting effect that the invitation would have on his life. The two men first met 5 years earlier at a luncheon that Johnson hosted for young, up-and-coming businessmen in Texas. Valenti subsequently volunteered as a floor aide at the 1960 Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles, where LBJ vied unsuccessfully for his party's presidential nomination, and that fall directed the Kennedy-Johnson ticket's advertising in Texas. "I knew few people in the Johnson entourage," he later admitted. "Though I was a Johnson man, and though I supported him vigorously and wholeheartedly and without reservation, I literally was on the darker edges of the last ring of the peripheral circle." Texas had long been a sturdy brick in the Democratic Party's firewall. It remained critical to JFK's re-election prospects, but its electorate was drifting steadily rightward. Hoping to repair a widening breach between the state organization's liberal and conservative factions, Kennedy and Johnson scheduled a multi-day political and fundraising swing that would carry them from Houston to Fort Worth, to Dallas, and then Austin, and finally to the LBJ Ranch, deep in the Texas Hill Country, where the first and second families would break bread together over a weekend replete with political and symbolic importance. For Johnson, the stakes were high. He had never been especially close to the Kennedy clan, and in recent years, his relationship with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and closest political advisor, had grown sharply discordant. Quietly beleaguered by a series of slow, percolating scandals involving his personal finances, and seemingly powerless to forge a truce between liberal and conservative Democrats in his own backyard, LBJ was no longer a certain asset to the president, either nationally or in Texas. He had legitimate reason to fear persistent low whispers that Kennedy intended to drop him from the ticket the following year. Facing these trials, the vice president called on trusted friends from Texas to ensure a successful presidential visit. Valenti had been charged with organizing a critical leg of the journey, a dinner in honor of Representative Albert Thomas in Houston on November 21st. Despite widespread concern that the city's conservative citizens would shun the president, over 350,000 cheering local residents lined the city streets to greet JFK and his wife, who had arrived at 4:23 p.m. in the lateness of a blue-skied day, Valenti later recalled, on the sleek, silver-bellied Boeing 707 Air Force One. Riding in the official motorcade, he noticed that his seatmate, Kenneth O'Donnell, a principal White House aide, was dour, unsmiling, and visibly nervous. Only when he saw the crowds, 3, 4, and 5 deep, did O'Donnell relax. "They're here, aren't they?" he muttered with satisfaction. "They damn sure are," Valenti replied. Privately, he was equally relieved, and even more so when over 3,000 local business and civic leaders packed the Sam Houston Coliseum for the evening's dinner reception. Short in stature, but hard to miss in a crowd, his dress was natty, recalled one of his contemporaries, and he was imaginative, quick-thinking, and fast-talking, a lively, friendly, sentimental human being. Valenti was swept up in the moment. When LBJ pulled him backstage to meet the president, Kennedy warmly shook his hand and thanked him for producing so stellar a turnout. He very much wanted to join the flight to the next stop, Fort Worth, and then on to Dallas and Austin the following day. But his wife, Mary Margaret, a former secretary in Johnson's Senate and vice presidential offices, had given birth to their first child just 3 weeks earlier. "Is this trip necessary?" she muttered with disapproval, even as she obligingly packed an overnight valise for Jack, complete with 2 changes of clothing. After the president and the vice president finished their remarks at the Houston dinner, Valenti boarded the vice president's Boeing 707, a near but not exact replica of Air Force One, for the journey to Fort Worth. The next morning, November 22nd, he flew with LBJ's entourage to Dallas, where Kennedy and Johnson were scheduled to address a luncheon at the city's Trade Mart. At Love Field, around 12 p.m., Valenti stepped into a van with other vice presidential and White House aides, including Evelyn Lincoln, the president's private secretary. The motorcade went through Dallas, Valenti would remember, and we were all remarking about how marvelous the reception was. It was about as big as it was in Houston. There were no hostile faces, not even a hostile sign, which was amazing. At the head of the official column led an unmarked police car, flanked by uniformed officers on motorcycles. Next in line was the deep blue presidential limousine, which carried John and Jacqueline Kennedy and Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie. They were followed in turn by a heavily fortified, open-topped limousine. Reporters called it the Queen Mary, packed with 8 Secret Service agents, 4 in the passenger seats and 4 others on running boards to either side, with O'Donnell and his fellow White House aide David Powers installed in the jump seats. LBJ's gray limousine, a rental, was next in line, trailing the Queen Mary at a distance of 75 feet. Behind LBJ traveled the vice presidential follow car, then a vehicle carrying 3 members of the press pool, a transport for other members of the news media, and vans and buses conveying news photographers, video men, and local elected officials. Valenti later estimated that his van was roughly 12th in the motorcade. As the convoy turned onto Main Street, then right onto Houston Street, and left onto Elm, he witnessed the impressive multitude of office workers who cheered from the windows of tall downtown buildings, and saw the crowds, 5 and more deep, hoisting homemade signs in the bright afternoon sun, and waving with admiration at the procession. "It was a beautiful day, beautiful weather," noted a reporter who was present that afternoon. Too far back in line to hear the piercing crack of a rifle shot, followed by 2 more in close succession, Valenti first sensed trouble shortly after 12:30 p.m., when, all of a sudden, the motorcade began without reason to speed up, tripling the speed, maybe quadrupling it. We attempted to keep up, and we knew something was wrong because all of a sudden we got separated from the cars. Uncertain what to do, his driver steered a direct course to the Trade Mart. Around the time that Valenti was marveling at the warm embrace that the citizens of Dallas had extended to the president, Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's White House press secretary, was traveling aboard SAM 86972, the tail number of a Boeing 707 jet identical to the vice president's plane, en route to an economic forum in Tokyo. Also on the flight were half of the president's cabinet, including the secretaries of the Departments of State, Treasury, Commerce, Labor, Agriculture, and Interior, and the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisers, CEA. Flying at an altitude of 35,000 feet, with nothing but blue sky around them, the men and their wives were already 900 miles west of Honolulu. Salinger quietly leafed through a dense briefing book on Japanese economics, while inside the plane's cramped communication shack, two news tickers. One,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?